History of Methodism in Tennessee. Miss Charlotte Robertson died at the residence of her son-in-law, John B. Craig, Esquire, 3 miles from Nashville on Sunday evening, the 11th of June, 1843. Miss Charlotte Robertson, relic of the late James Robertson, a pioneer of Tennessee. Miss Charlotte Robertson's maiden name was Reeves. She was born in Northampton County, North Carolina, in the year 1751. Now we're going to jump down to the last paragraph. It starts here. They lived in forts for years and suffered many privations, frequently being attacked by the Indians in the most ferocious manner. Two of Miss Robertson's sons were massacred by the Indians in those early and troublesome times. Throughout all the hardships and dangers, Miss Robertson was preserved and lived to see her 93rd year. She was the mother of 11 children, only 5 of whom survive her, but she has a living posterity now scattered throughout the valley, numbering considerably over 200 souls. The history of Middle Tennessee. There were other occurrences which prove that savages were daily in the neighborhood, but we passed the account of the engagement of the 2nd of April, 1781, commonly called the Battle of the Bluff. We condense from Haywood. During the night, the 1st of April, a numerous party of Cherokees came and lay in ambush near the fort. In the morning, 3 of them approached the fort, fired, and ran off, yet not out of sight, for they were seen reloading their guns and occasionally waving their hand to attract noise. This was evidently to banter and defiance. It was so regarded by the whites they could not endure to be thus bearded, and although there was some talk of the danger of an ambush, the men resolved to go forth to battle. A party of more than 20 mounted their horses and rode forth the gate. They dashed down the descending ground toward Broad Street and the Branch in pursuit of the retreating foe. The few Indians who had kept themselves in sight and tempted the whites to come on made a stand near the bank of the creek. This position is near the junction of College and Demond Street. The men dismounted at Broad to give battle. A considerable body of Indians was concealed in the bed of the creek and among the thick bushes, and suddenly fired upon the horsemen as they dismounted. The fire was returned with electricity and with some effect. The horses fled up the hill towards the fort. At this moment, another party of the savages raised the yell and war whoop and dashed from their hiding places on the side of the hill near Cherry Street. They attempted to head and catch the horses, which fled towards the French Lick. Quite a number of Indians pursued the horses. Some of the horses ran by the fort. Finding the gate closed, continued towards the spring. At this juncture, and while the fight was continuing in the bottom, a larger body of Indians had arisen from their covert and commenced a movement towards the fort, not only to cut off the retreat of the small number of whites at the creek, but to attack and enter the fort. The horses passed through their line and drew after them many who preferred the capture of such a prize to any respect for discipline and command of chiefs. At this moment also, the dogs in the fort, seeing the confusion and hearing the firing, ran towards the branch or low grounds that came upon the yet unbroken line of enemy. These dogs were trained to hostility to savages, and they made a furious onset and kept the Indians busily employed in self-defense. The pursuit of the horses and the contest with the dogs so occupied the Indians and withdrew them from their position and aimed to intercept the party at the branch or attack the fort, that a way was opened for escape or retreat to the fort, and for some aid to advance from the fort. Had these Indians maintained their position or extended their line towards the river, not a man could have returned to the fort. They were in great peril at all times. The savages, with whom they were immediately engaged, greatly outnumbered them, and a much larger force interposed between them and their friends at the fort. 5 of their number had been killed, and 2 disabled by wounds. They resolved to attempt an escape to the fort. Taking with them the 2 wounded companions, they commenced to run and were pursued by their enemies. There was no time to reload their guns. To have stopped would have been an encounter in overwhelming force. It would have been an easy matter for the main body of the enemy to have swept across the river's bank and thus completely enclosed the disabled and now disarmed whites. That they did not thus intercept and capture or destroy them can only be accounted for, as was done, in the exclamation of some of the pious mothers, "Thanks be to God," and that he gives Indians a fear of dogs and a love of horses. The civil and political history of the state of Tennessee. In the spring of 1781, a second day of April, a numerous party of Cherokees came in the night and lay in ambush. In the morning, 3 of them came and fired at the fort on the bluff and ran off. 19 horsemen in the fort mounted their horses and followed them. When they came to the branch over which the stone bridge now is, they discovered the Indians in the creek and the thickets near it. They arose and fired upon the horsemen. The latter dismounted to give them battle, and returned their fire with great electricity. Another party of Indians lay concealed in the privy and bush and cedars near the place where Mr. Demern's house is, who was ready to rush into the fort on the back of the combatants. The horses ran to the fort and left their owners on foot. Hearing the firing, those in the fort closed the gate. Such of the 19 as were left alive retreated the fort. Several of them were killed on the spot, namely Peter Gill, Alexander Buchanan, George Kennedy, Zachariah White, and Captain Leeper. Other of them were wounded, namely James Manafee and Joseph Moonshaw. At the place where the stone house of Cross now stands, Isaac Lucas had his thigh broken by a ball, and being left by his comrades who ran into the fort, the Indians rushed upon him to take his scalp. One of them running towards him, and being a short distance, Lucas, having his gun charged, fired upon and shot him through the body, and he died instantly. The people in the fort, in order to save Lucas, kept up a brisk and warm fire upon the parties of Indians who had attempted them to get to them, and finally succeeded in drawing them off. When Lucas, was taken and brought into the fort by his own people, when the Indians fired upon the horsemen at the branch, the body which lay in ambush at Demern's rose and marched toward the river, forming a line between the combatants and the fort. When those from the mount dismounted to fire upon the Indians in the branch, and the firing on both sides actually commenced, the horses took fright and ran at full speed on the south side of the Indian line toward the French lick, passing by the fort on the bluff. Seeing this, and the number of Indians in line, eager to get possession of the horses, left their ranks and went in pursuit of them. And at this instant, the dogs in the fort, seeing the confusion and hearing the firing, ran towards the branch and came into part of the Indian line, which remained yet unbroken. And as they had been trained to hostility against the Indians, made a furious onset upon them and disabled them from doing anything more than defending themselves. While thus employed, the retreating whites passed near them through the interval made by the desertion of those from the line who had gone in pursuit of the horses. Had not been for these fortunate circumstances, the whites could never retreated to the fort through the Indian line, which had taken post between them and the fort. Such of the 19 who had survived when they retreated would have had to break the line, their own guns being empty, while those of the Indians were well charged. Among those who retreated towards the fort was Edward Swanson, who pursued by an Indian that overtook him, punching him with the muzzle of his gun in the back and drawing the trigger when the gun snapped. Swanson laid hold of the muzzle, wringing the lock to one side, spilled the priming from the pan. The Indian, looking into the pan, not seeing the powder in it, struck him with the gun barrel and the muzzle foremost.